All right. We are back. Lab number 8, El Ocho. So this is an exciting lecture, you guys, because today we're going to start to memorize the bones of the skull. Now, the cranium consists of the skull and the jaw, as you remember, and there are 22 bones that make up your cranium. You don't need to know all 22 of them. You need to know some of them, the big ones. And remember that each of these large bones is separated by something called a suture. They kind of look like those zippers that separate those different bones. When you're a baby, those need to stay unfused so that you can squeeze through your mama's vajayjay and you pop your head out without cracking your skull. And then later on, as you grow, about 18 months into it, you start to zip some of these together. And then by the time you're about 30, the final suture zips together. So it's a slow, involved process. Let's get started. I'm going to get you familiar with some of the basic features of the cranium, starting off with those big eye sockets, which we call the orbits. Next, the nasal aperture. You can see there's a lot of weird stuff going on in there. Those are called the nasal concha. They're covered with mucosa and goo, and they help filter and humidify air when you breathe in. I wish this was a real lab because you get to play with skulls and it's really cool. But you can practice by picking your nose, I guess, and getting up in there. See if you can feel your nasal concha. The nasal aperture. Above that are your nasal bones. Now what's interesting is the bones of your nose only make up about half of your nose. If you kind of feel your nose, just kind of feel your nose, you can wiggle the tip, and about halfway up as you're wiggling, you start to feel where the bones are. And these are a pair of bones. Like most bones of the skull, everything is paired up. So the 22 bones is more like just, 10, 11 pairs or so. Here are some bones you don't need to know. By the way, I'm gonna flag the slides you need to know. There are 7 bones you need to know. The lacrimal ones, the lacrimal bones are not some of the bones you need to memorize. But if you speak Latin or Spanish, you know lagrima means tears. The lacrimal bones give rise to the tear ducts. And next to them, kind of on the inside of the orbits, are the ethmoid bones. Check them out. They're small little bones. And if you actually check this out, take a look. Let me get this thing going here. If you take a look right there, that little groove right there, that's your tear duct. When you cry, the tears start from a tear duct on this side, and then they drain down here, and then your nose gets all wet and drippy. Very artistic. Okay, you don't need to know those bones. This is the first bone you do need to know. And I want you to say the word frontal as you take your hand and slap your forehead. Say frontal. Excellent. It's a pretty easy one. All there in blue. You can see it bumps up against the nasal bones up front. It bumps up against the lacrimal and the ethmoid bones inside the orbit. And then right behind it is another very large set of bones. Check it out, the frontal bone. By the way, when you're a baby, there's actually a suture down the middle, but it is one of the first bones to fuse, and it fuses when you're just about 18 months of age. The frontal bone. Everybody touch your frontal bone, say frontal. Good. The best way to learn these bones is to be ridiculous and just play with your head and touch the bones and say their names. The next one are the parietal bones. There's one on the left and there's one on the right. What I want you to do is take your hands, interdigitate your fingers so that you're kind of holding your own hand, and then rest it on top of your head. Up top, those are a pair of parietal bones. Not down low by your ears, but up a little higher. Now, if you speak Latin, you know the word for wall, Spanish, paredes, yeah, something like that, right? So parietal derived from Latin. These bones come in a pair and they zip down the middle, which we'll see in a minute. Now, everybody pat your weave in the back. Ooh, my weave itch. That is your occipital bone. Now, the occipital bone, everybody touch your occipital bone. Say occipital. The British call it the occiput. It wraps underneath your skull and it serves as the base, the foundation of your skull. So that purple business keeps going and going, and it wraps up and under your skull. You can't see it in this picture, but you'll see it in a few minutes. Here is your temporal bone. Now check out how complicated this one is. It has this sort of arch that merges with your cheekbone. See that? It's called the zygomatic arch. Here's your acoustic meatus, or your ear hole. It's pretty basic. This is called the mastoid process. Mast means boobs or breasts. Interestingly, guys have bigger mastoids, bigger boobs on their skull than women. But you'll see that the temporal bone bumps up against the parietal bone, and there's a suture that I'll give you the name of in a few minutes that fuses those two bones together when you reach adulthood. This is also on your quiz. Did I flag that? Yeah, all these bones so far are on your quiz. The mandible. You are no longer allowed to call this your jawbone. Hold on to your jaw and say mandible. Mandible. Good job. The maxilla holds your upper teeth. It is basically the front of your face, but it's also on the midline, makes up the margins of your nasal aperture. Check it out. Here's the maxilla, and it kind of serves as the underside of your orbits. Comes right up against your cheekbone. It's this really cool looking bone right there. So that has teeth, so does the mandible. Everybody touch the side of your face right next to your nose and say maxilla. Maxilla. Trust me, the stupider you are when you study these, the more you'll remember it. Next, one of the coolest names for a bone in your face, your cheekbone, is now officially known as the zygomatic. So take your maxilla, spread it out a little bit to where your cheekbones are the most prominent along the side. Poke your cheeks and say zygomatic, zygomatic. There you go. Here it is again from the side view, the lateral view, the zygomatic bone, that peach-colored bone that's interposed between your frontal bone up top and your maxilla on the bottom. It also is contiguous with this zygomatic arch that I just mentioned. There are some muscles that go through that. There's some muscles that hang from that. Those are involved in chewing. And when we look at fossils, you'll see that that bone is in flux depending on what these guys are eating and how big their muscles for chewing are. So here is the zygomatic. Zygomatic. Excellent. One more time. Zygomatic. It's your cheekbone. Excellent. On your quiz, which is timed, by the way, you're only going to have 5 minutes. I'm going to hit you with pictures of bones. You better tell me the name of the bone. Don't get nervous. If you study, you'll be fine. Only 7 bones of the skull that I'm going to make you study. This one you do not need to know. It's called the sphenoid. Most of the bone, 90% of it, is actually on the inside of your skull. So we'll see that when I show you this little movie in a few minutes of what goes on inside the skull as well. But you don't need to know this one. Let's skip it, yeah? Now here's some anatomical terms. The word foramen is a fancy anatomic word for a hole. You have lots of foramina, holes in your bones. Some of them are in your skull. And there is a foramen on your mandible. See that? That's where a nerve and a vein and an artery pass. And they exit out the front through the mental foramen. The foramina, or holes, give us a clue as to how big the nerves were, how big the blood supply was. Cool research that we can do on these things when we find fossils. So here is the mandible, and here are the foramina, foramen being the singular term for those holes. Make sure you know what the word foramen means. And here is another one. When we flip the skull over, we look at the underside of the skull, the inferior aspect. You can see why this one was named foramen ovale. Right next to it is the foramen spinosum, because it's next to this spine business here. But there's a really big one, and I want you to know the name of this big hole at the bottom of your skull. Everybody say foramen magnum. Now you know what foramen means, hole. Magnum means, keep it clean, big. Magnum means big. It's the big hole at the bottom of your skull, and this is where your spinal cord comes and goes and sends information to and from your body to your brain. So that's kind of cool. You already are familiar with the sagittal plane, and I want you just to remember that the sagittal suture, that zipper that runs down the middle of the skull, is the sagittal suture. I also want you to remember the coronal suture. So here is the coronal plane and the coronal suture, and you've got your sagittal. Whoa, I gotta quit sniffing glue. the sagittal suture. There's one more that you're not going to really be able to see from this superior view of the skull. It's called the lambdoidal suture. And if you know your Greek letters, lambda is kind of like an upside down V. Let's look at this from the back. There it is. This lambdoidal suture is kind of squiggly, but it sort of kind of looks like that upside down letter V. This one's a mess, but there it is. That is the suture that joins together this back of the skull. That's the occipital bone. And the parietal bones, P for parietal, P for parietal, which wraps up around the top of your head. You down with OPP? I just made that up. The squamosal suture is the one that connects your temporal bone to your parietal bones. Everybody say squamosal. That means flat. It's different from the other ones. It's not really a zipper. It sort of imbricates. One bone folds over the other one. Kind of like tiles on a roof, that sort of thing. Nonetheless, it fuses when you're an adult, and when we start to play around with the age and sex of skulls, you'll be able to figure out how old an individual is based on the sutures, whether they're fused or whether they're not fused. Squamosal suture, keep that one in mind. Now, if I were to ask you on your quiz, what two bones, two of the large bones, does the squamosal suture, here it is, squamosal suture, what two major bones does that join? You see the green one? What's that one called? Parietal. And the pink one? Temporal bone. Okay, good. So here are the bones. There are 7: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, mandible, zygomatic, and the maxilla. Play Simon Says. This is how I learned my bones. I had somebody just say, Simon says, touch your parietal. And I would touch my parietal, slapping the side top of my head. Somebody say occipital, and just practice your bones. You'll have this in 10, 15 minutes. You'll be fluent in your bones, and you'll do really well on my quiz. Let me walk you through this little movie that I found. I don't know where I stole it, but it's really cool. And what we're going to do is we're going to explode the skull. We're going to rotate. We're going to see what goes on the inside as well. So I told you about the sphenoid bone. That's that big red thing in the middle. This is it looks like a bat. So we're going to skip that. We're not going to worry about that for our purposes, but there it is. It makes up the most of the interior of your skull, actually. So up front, the green, that's your frontal. What do you call that blue one on the top? That's your parietal. The occipital is at the bottom, but check it out. It's also the base of your skull. You see that? And you see the big hole? Skip all this stuff in the middle. Nobody cares. I'm not testing you on this stuff. Way too much for intro to anthropology. This is later on when you go to med school. Here they go. They're coming back together, guys. Look at the maxilla with the teeth up front, the mandible, the teeth at the bottom, and the zygomatic. Check it out. Here is the occipital bone coming your way, the purple bone, the back of the skull, and there's your lambdoidal suture. See the parietal bone and the occipital bone? The temporal bones make up the lower sides. Now here's your sagittal suture, which separates those two very large parietal bones. Got it? Your coronal suture separates the frontal bone, the green bone, from the parietals. Here's the inside view again. The sphenoid is this big giant bat in the middle of your head. You got your pituitary gland perched on top of it, and really cool stuff. Too bad we're not meeting in person, because it's really fun to play with dead people and stick your fingers in their foramen magnum. Look at the big hole. There it is. The foramen magnum. Now look at your maxilla. It's that purple bone, but it also makes up the roof of your mouth. It's your palate. It's a very complicated bone, the maxilla. So if I were to ask you, what bones have teeth? Would you know the answer to that? Here she comes. Here she comes. Hang on. Hey, what's the name of that green bone up front? That is your frontal. Here's your maxilla again. Got it? Again, if I were to ask you what two cranial bones have teeth, you got the one up top. What's that called? Around your nose? That's your maxilla. Excellent. And the one on the bottom? The mandible. The mandible. Everybody cool? That's all I got for you. I will smell you next time. Peace.